Hello, today we're going to talk about a couple of subjects in the discussion of the 1790 anti-slavery petitions that entered into Congress, and also the very important but I think little understood and maybe even little known about Treaty of New York between the United States and the Creek Indians in the American Southwest. And by Southwest in 1790, we're talking about regions of Georgia and Alabama. So we're going to start talking, as we always do, a little bit about the historiography. This set of lectures and material came from a couple of books that I came across a while ago, and they're written by the same author. His name is Joseph Ellis, and they're outstanding books. The title of the discussion in the first part we would call The Silence, because it comes from his chapter in a book called Founding Brothers called The Silence. And it's basically a reference to the unspoken subject that no one in Congress wanted to talk about. So both of these titles, Founding Brothers and American Creation, are fantastic because they give you a window into a number of subjects. I mean, just off the top of my head, Valley Forge, the creation of the political parties. There's a great chapter on John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, kind of their reconciliation in the 1820s. As we know, they're going to become political opponents during the 1790s. American Creation also has, I think, one of the best chapters on the Louisiana Purchase. So it's just something to look at if you're interested. They read like stories, but also mini lectures and discussions. So the chapters, I mean, it's dealing with multiple different subjects in one book. And Ellis, I enjoy personally his writing style. Others may not, but I've learned a lot about early American history and this time period, which is a time period he's worked in quite a bit. So again, just giving you a little bit of that background. Founding Fathers chic, as it was called, this kind of idea that the founding generation came in vogue again during the 1990s. We had the John Adams book that became the miniseries on HBO, and the biographies, of course. And I think that hasn't gone away in some instances, because from all of these ideas of recasting these individuals, we do get the giant book on Hamilton, and from that we get, of course, the musical, which did get folks interested, at least in this time period. So we're going to start with, there we go, the notes. And first introduce everything by discussing the very unwanted and undesired entry in the record of the Congress of some anti-slavery petitions. So to set the date for you in the discussion of the first Congress, this is a Congress that is dealing with a lot of different matters. It's February of 1790, and we get two Quaker delegations. And, you know, we've got a lot in the U.S. Congress, like the question of where the capital is going to be located. Later in the year, we'll get Hamilton's financial plan. James Madison is working on a number of things to get the government up and running and to establish the legitimacy of the executive branch. So two Quaker delegations, and they're from different states. One is from New York and the other is from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And they present these petitions to the House of Representatives, and that's something that, you know, you can do, and it was uncertain about how to directly appeal to the government. But Congress people can bring in petitions, and later on under the First Amendment, you can obviously petition the government under the First Amendment. So these come in, and they arrive in the House, so the People's Chamber. You know, there are more members, faster turnover every 2 years. And these particular petitions were asking for the federal government to put an end to the African slave trade immediately. This was the idea of cutting off the slave trade. And it is something of an awkward interruption. This is a Congress that is talking about the Hamilton's plan. Multiple parts are coming in, and they're debating them one at a time. The plan about assuming the debts that we'll get into in a future discussion, kind of the three areas of Hamilton's financial plan. Also, what was coming up, it was called the residency question. The residency question deals with where would be the future location for the United States national government to be resided in. There were a number of different areas. A lot of folks wanted it in the South. New York obviously wanted to keep it. There was talk of moving it to Philadelphia. That was an idea as well. So you had all these matters and others, two of them I just mentioned. And it also brought about a unique response from several of the Southern representatives, and they denounced this. The first to say anything about it was James Jackson, and he came up from Georgia, and he was, red in the face, shaking, positively, apoplectic about the entire matter. The problem that he had, among other things, is, I thought this matter was settled, and why are we listening to anybody such as Quakers? Now, Quakers have a reputation, resented by some, that in the case of this congressman, James Jackson of Georgia, he said they're kind of these naive innocents, and they were, dripping this sanctimonious idea of abolition. Why are we even hearing them? He was asking questions because there was a connection between the Quakers and the American Rebellion, the American Revolution, where because of their pacifism, the Quakers were basically, sitting out of the conflict. So, we could have used all the help we could have gotten. Jackson and others are arguing, and then we had these Quakers sit by the sidelines, and it wasn't really right for us to listen to any of their concerns. So that idea was, of course, seconded by other members of the Congress. So throughout American history, what might surprise you is this idea that oftentimes you see from the North, folks standing up and saying, yeah, I agree with the congressman from South Carolina or from Virginia. And, that makes this argument that slavery is a national institution. Sometimes you have Northern congressmen and senators saying, yes, it's one of those things where it's probably best for us to not discuss the subject, or with the recognition that discussing the subject can really cause a split in the nation. So you have this inflammatory proposal. And then you have further on, it's seconded by his fellow Southerner. His name was William Lawton Smith. So Congressman Smith of South Carolina seconds this objection and speaks about the patriotism or lack of patriotism when it comes to the Quakers, or as they call themselves, the Society of Friends. He also brought up a very, pertinent fact. And Smith said that Article 1, Section 9, again, this is an element of the Constitution. Article 1 deals with the question of slavery. It deals with the legislative branch. And I'll read from it. The migration or importation of such persons, notice they don't use the S word, but everyone knows what they're talking about. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. So, to talk about it differently and translate it, Congress cannot do anything about the slave trade until the year 1808. Several members of the Congress were actually in attendance at the at the Constitutional Convention. They were there, and they were once again in Congress. So it makes sense in some ways that they would understand they were there when that phrase was written. So to say Smith's argument another way, he's reminding everyone that, look, what the Quakers were asking for has been declared unavailable, or we as Congress can't deal with it. But James Jackson of Georgia, the one who originally objected to these and was the one so angry about the introduction of these anti-slavery petitions, sees something more of a bad scheme or nefarious or underhanded goal by those anti-slavery societies. They say they are just wanting to stop the slave trade, but what they're really doing is attacking slavery itself. This is the first step. And it makes sense because, a lot of abolitionist groups around the world, whether they be in the United States, and the Quakers, most of their the friends in the American states, decided that you should not be a Quaker and also own slaves. And so this was one of those ideas, whether it be in the United States or overseas, that if we stop the slave trade, we'd stop slavery eventually. Not realizing, of course, that the populations of slaves already in the United States were enough to sustain numbers, obviously, up through the time of the American Civil War. So now we have into all of this James Madison, who rises up and says, look, let's everyone catch our breaths here, calm down. What we need to do is just remind everybody of the situation, and the situation is clear. Congress cannot do anything about this. Congress cannot address what the anti-slavery petitions want. If we are measured in how we deal with this, it will hopefully all go away. So it's a way to tell Jackson and Smith of Georgia and South Carolina, respectively, restrain yourself, calm down. Any kind of overwrought opposition is going to just fan the flames and make things worse. Unfortunately, things did get worse, because the next day you get a petition from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And it's a very effective way to just enter in these petitions, have them read. Folks who are from the South will bristle at these readings. Folks in the North who don't want this to take up the time of Congress are also going to be annoyed by the entire process. So this next day, this petition comes in from Pennsylvania, and it asks the same thing, end the traffic of slaves and have Congress intervene. And this one is directly linked to the trade of slavery itself. And since Congress can relate that, it deals with commerce, it deals with the powers it's been given under the Constitution. It just makes a lot of sense, and Congress clearly can do it. It's a little more troubling for those Southerners I mentioned, Jackson and William Lawton Smith, because the Pennsylvania petition makes the points very clearly. It's with an effort to cause a stir and to be read out loud. It says in this petition that slavery is not compatible with the ideals of the American Revolution. This is an inconsistency, and a lot of the people know it. Madison knows it. Some people probably don't think it's an inconsistency, but there are generally ideas that these things couldn't operate together. This revolution for human rights, while we still continued to have this practice. The second mention in the petition is that maybe you could, as at Congress. I mean, originally in the Constitution, there was a 20-year ban, but there are other parts of Article 1 that dealt with the Congress and the legislature that, for example, we'll throw out a few. The second petition says the General Welfare Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, right? All of that means that, you can manipulate and change the laws if it's necessary and if there is the political will. And then the third element to this story is that the petition arrived with a cover letter essentially from Benjamin Franklin. So, outside of George Washington, there's no one who has revolutionary bona fides more than Ben Franklin. The man is in his 80s at this point. It's one of his last public acts as as a man on the scene. I think he'll actually die later in 1790. So when it carries that signature, you really can't ignore it. And the name on the petition, Franklin's name, essentially eliminates what Madison had wanted. Hey, everybody, let's receive the request calmly. Let's banish the idea of Congress doing anything with the slave trade in 20 years, and let's move on. But that doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen because of that second day, that new petition with Franklin's name on it. It can't be done because it's Franklin. So everything else is put aside, and for the next day, a committee in Congress makes it the business of the entire House to figure out how to deal with this. And during the next 4 to 6 hours during that day, when Congress meets, they say and they utter things that were never talked about in a public forum on the issue of slavery. Now, we can talk about slavery and the slavery compromises at the Constitutional Convention. That's right. And you might think, well, that wasn't a public open debate about slavery, except that it wasn't. In Philadelphia, all of the different debates were closed off. Remember, they met and swore themselves to secrecy until the very end. And a lot of people like to see that maybe later on, over the Missouri Compromise question in 1820, 1821, there was a public debate about slavery. Yeah, in some ways, more about how it would develop in the West. But the arguments that no one wanted to have, literally defending slavery, that happened. That happened in February of 1790. So yes, it did take place, the subject of slavery at the convention. But the debates of the convention were only published later. Those who were able to push through, and Madison was there. Remember, he says it's one of the two big topics at the convention that could have split everybody. Large states versus small states, and the question of slavery, or as he put it, those states that had slaves and those that did not. Madison decided, and a lot of other people who ended up signing the document and defending it, saying that, look, we know what we're talking about when we have these vague statements. We're talking about slaves. We have 3 slavery petitions in the Constitution, but it's much too important a subject to talk about in public. And you see why. When it gets talked about in public, you have folks like James Jackson and William Lawton Smith of the Deep South. I mean, these aren't Maryland and Virginians. They represent South Carolina and Georgia, which have really strong ties to the institution of slavery and do not want it tampered with in any way. Not even any discussion, any talk of ending the slave trade. So the very idea of the topic brought up reminds a lot of people of sedition. You hear that the subject will bring about trumpets of civil war. These are, again, just some of the excerpts of people talking. It's just a quick reminder that no one wants to bring it up out in the open. Then a Northern congressman says, look, why can't we talk about it? Because there are 2 different issues really here at play. And they try to chime in and say the slave trade is one thing, slavery is another. So we're not talking about the defense of what's been called more and more a peculiar institution. And that's what a lot of the Southern congressmen do. They essentially say, it's brought on by our parents and grandparents. It's a necessary evil. You start to hear some defenders of slavery. It had been in the Bible. God had ordained things to be this way. There were practical aspects like, who's going to grow rice and manufacture indigo if not for the slaves? And that's when you hear even Jackson of Georgia. This is an area that has rice and some tobacco and indigo plantations. Jackson goes so far as to say in Congress, quote, rice cannot be brought to market without these people, unquote. Who will do it? And so you begin this back and forth over this debate in February 1790 about tolerating the institution in the short run, which is what everyone thought they were going to do at the Constitutional Convention. So in other words, it gets down to Madison's choice. Are we going to form a union, or are we going to form a union where those who are so opposed to slavery go off in their own direction, and you have, the United States of New England, and you have maybe the middle states who were kind of in between, gradual manumission of slaves, and then you have, the United Colonies or the states of the South. That's what Madison wanted to avoid, and was willing to make compromises on the question of slavery. John Page of Virginia, that's where Madison is from, argued that in this particular case, as much as everyone wants it to go away, silence is the worst thing that could happen. It would embolden slaves to rebel in the South. And a vote by this committee on a whole recommends that these petitions, those from New York and multiple ones that are now in from Pennsylvania, go to a committee, which will then report its findings to the South. And that effectively shuts down debate for the short term. So it ends for a time being, everyone hopes. One of the fullest exchanges on views that have will define the United States. The other we'll talk about as we go along today, and that obviously is a just, equitable policy for Native Americans. So we know what the founders did and what they didn't do. This represents a couple of their major failings. So the House report. So you have a small section of the members of the House, and Madison, not surprising, he's everywhere, right? In 1789, 1790, well, he's in this committee as well. So the House report comes out the next month. We're in March now of 1990, and Madison handles the whole thing by saying, look, and his reaction tells us what he feels. The subject is off limits, verboten, taboo, whatever you want to call it. Several Northern delegations suddenly say that, well, we really didn't want to have this debate. The subject came up and it was awkward, and we didn't mean for it to be thrust out in the open. And what are these people saying who were, a few weeks ago, very strongly in favor of possibly following the recommendations of Pennsylvania? And Pennsylvania was saying, yes, if it's sure, it may be a 20-year ban, but there are other parts of the Constitution that say Congress can act. And so reading this section of different accounts of this story, and Ellis is good in this area, he begs the question, one of those what ifs. Was there another deal? Was there another deal made behind the scenes where all of a sudden the Northern congressmen are like, yes, let's not talk about it. Let's move on. And as Ellis explains it in his chapter called The Silence, he's very crafty in saying, Madison doesn't leave any footprints. So we'll never know. In other words, there's no paper trail. Obviously no emails, but no written account of what that committee would have done behind closed doors, and then come out of that committee and then reported to the entire House. So the committee report is essentially put aside, the details of which are going to be, reported later. And the end of this story is essentially that Madison and company in this House committee decided that they were going to just reinforce what everyone thought. Congress was going to make a statement so that there would be no further chance of any of these troublesome anti-slavery petitions coming in. There is going to be no discussion of Congress's ability to emancipate slaves. So this report has 3 different resolutions, and this is where the whole, Congress is going to look at this and basically say, yeah, that's great, let's move on. And they mostly reinforce these resolutions from Madison's committee that, everybody kind of acknowledged. You can't do anything about the slave trade until 1808, and this committee never recommended that they would do anything. reminded all of the Congress that their power in Congress is restrained. So you can't limit the slave trade. Congress can't emancipate slaves in any way, shape, or form until 1808. Now, states could. States wanted to pass laws to do that? Sure. Individual owners manumit or free their slaves? Yes. They'd have to follow the laws of their respective state, some of which said that if you free a slave that you own, you have to transport for his or her movement out of the state. And so the revised report that Congress will eventually endorse backs up this idea, which I just stated. Only states can make any kind of emancipation law changes. In other words, we go from a possible chance of a gradual emancipation at the federal government to, hey, federal government, you're going to completely stay out of it. And out of it forever. So they reinforce what was stated in Article 1 of the Constitution. Can't do anything with it at the federal level for 20 years, which equals 1808. Washington weighs in on all of this and says that it's over and done with. His quote is, "The slave business has at last been put to rest and will scarce awake." Unquote. Well, yes, he doesn't want it to wake up. It's going to tear the country apart potentially, and then later on it will. But it creates a precedent for a long time. 1833, you have Daniel Webster making arguments about the fact that going back to an earlier generation, making references to 1790. This very incident we're talking about, now we have it 40 odd years later, this congressman from the North saying, yeah, Congress can't really do anything with it. There's no power within the federal government to emancipate slaves. It's a very, very interesting story, this so-called silence. It's a window of an opportunity. It's opened a crack. It is filled with possibilities. What if the revolutionary generation could have done in the first Congress what it could not accomplish at the Constitutional Convention? But it's maybe going too far to think there was ever a chance. Was this an opportunity? Probably not. It never was a serious opportunity. What it did confirm is that minds hadn't changed from the Constitutional Convention to the first Congress. That if you're going to have and question any powers of the Congress to do anything about slaves, that's going to create real serious divisions in the country. And you could say goodbye to the Deep South states. And at this point, Professor Ellis, talking about this very story in his book, says that anti-slavery, the crusade of abolition, moves at this point more to the churches, especially the evangelical churches in the United States after 1790. And it will reemerge, obviously, as a national movement during the abolition movement of the 1820s, 30s, and beyond. And it takes on this idea when it is in the venue of churches that it's a national sin that needs to be really purged, if it could, at any point. Franklin, of course, is there on the scene, and that makes his involvement particularly interesting. He's the founding father, but maybe the founding grandfather would be more appropriate. And he, as a man who had put ads for runaway slaves in his newspaper at the very end of his life, and this is what you do at the end of your life. You try to enhance your legacy. He's far from that now, and I think he wanted to show everybody in a very public way that he endorsed these petitions and that the continuing slave trade and slavery itself was a violation of a lot of the principles of the American Revolution. So that episode we can call The Silence. The next we'll talk about is the treaty. So we're going to talk about the involvement of a few individuals in the Treaty of New York in 1790. So when we have these different discussions of the successes and failures of the founding, I mentioned that any kind of path to extinction of slavery has been considered one by our scholars today. I think it's fair. I don't know if they could have done anything more in that area. They attempted in 1790 to construct a just and lasting Indian policy. And this got further than anti-slavery petitions or moving the needle about federal power and slavery in February and March of 1790. The new government under Washington, and what you're looking at here, we had discussions and lectures on the cabinet. This is the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, who is front and center. Should be better known, is not. Should be better known just as an amazingly successful general during the American Revolution. But certainly in putting together the early military establishment of the United States, which was controversial because we come from this tradition of not wanting a strong military tradition or a standing army. So he's one of the main players in this story that takes place in 1790 as well. And where Knox is responsible is that he's going to be the cabinet member charged with bringing some kind of order to what can only be caused or called appropriately chaos. The American government does not want a treaty and does not want to enact a policy of removal, which we will do later, 40-odd years later under President Andrew Jackson. But at play in 1790 is another issue, and that is who controls Indian policy. Will it be the president? Will it be the president with the Senate? Will it be the states? In the past, it was a mix, a confusing mix of federal and state treaties, and they had some good results, but mostly bad. Mostly bad because treaties put together by the Congress, and by the Congress I mean the one that operated during the American Revolution, were never binding by the states. We know that the Congress had no enforcement power. So if states, or more specifically, the people in the states or territories violated those treaties, the government had no way to punish them or to punish the state. And a lot of these violations of treaties meant that indigenous people, Native Americans, would have to renegotiate treaties, and they'd lose land, and there would be confiscation. And time again, the folks who would undo these treaties were different settlers from the respective states. So here we have, for the first time, the executive branch with Washington and his newly put together formed cabinet. So that means it's going to be Jefferson and it's going to be Knox. Let's establish this as something the executive branch, the office of president and the cabinet does. And what's maybe little known about this episode is that Washington makes it a priority in his presidency. So he thinks this is a singularly important thing to do. He said if all of the cabinet failed, in his words, it would stain the nation. So I think, to say it differently, he's investing a lot of his reputation in prestige. But they also, this is the amazing part of this, all three men, Washington, Jefferson, and Knox, all think that they're up to the task. It's going to involve a lot of their creative energy. They will be able to get it done and have it be successful. They will break from tradition. We're going to do things unlike the Europeans, especially England. You know, creating this republic was a radical idea. Now, the idea of not having the republic as an conquering imperialist power would be dramatic as well. So it's the first chance for the United States to do things differently and not follow the same old European tradition. We're the victors. Now, this is the policy of among a lot of people in the States and a lot of folks who want to move west is that the losers of the American Revolution were the English, but they recovered. I mean, they lost the American colonies, but they were still Great Britain. The Native American people, for the most part, sided with England, with a couple of exceptions of different Indian nations, the Oneida and the Catawba. You can count literally on one hand the number of Indian nations who sided with the infant United States. But so the perception among most Americans is that they were on the wrong side, and we get to dictate the aftermath. As this nation has now gone from being contained along the Appalachian Mountains to now we expand to the Mississippi River. So the process begins when Knox, who you just saw the slide of, the Secretary of War, he writes Washington, and he knows how to engage Washington. Basically says that, this really would be a worthwhile endeavor. Why don't we treat the Indians like almost foreign entities or foreign nations? And if that was the case, we know that the president, under Article 2 of the Constitution, he is the head of the executive branch, and we can also construct Indian policy. The only way it should really go to Congress is, we're dealing with the foreign power, so we got to bring in the Senate, because the Senate can ratify the treaties. And that's what it does under Article 1. So he's throwing out, Knox, in appealing to Washington, what we would call this conquest theory. The idea that the Indians are tenants, they all have to respond to the will of the white government that's in charge. They lost, we won, we get to do what we want to. That would be the easy solution, and that would be the solution of a European nation basically winning in war and demanding to add colonies or demanding to add territory somewhere in Central Europe. That's the time-honored tradition. So removal would be imperialism. We like to say throughout our history, even when we got new territory, like after the War of 1898, also known as the Spanish-American War, that we don't have colonies. We did. They're territories and they're protectorates. They're kind of colonies, and we are not an empire. We're a republic, and it's a whole nother argument to have. But maybe we should go through and set upon a course by which we can treat Indians with respect. And this will be the model by which other treaties follow. And to his credit, Knox spends 1789 and 1790 reading all of these old treaties that were negotiated by the states, that were negotiated by the Confederation Congress, as we would call it, the Congress that met during the American Revolution. So he compares the best and worst out of these federal and state, and basically decides that they had kind of split the responsibilities, and from this point going forward, with this new stronger government, let just the executive branch deal with it. He also told the president, we have two possible scenarios. We can negotiate a treaty, or we can go to war. As we'll see in a future discussion, the United States does go to war with the Indian groups, the Indian Confederation in the Northwest, areas of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And it's a mess early on. What Knox is saying is that this kind of conquest policy would cost $15 million a year. This is not an option. And Washington can understand that. Yeah, that's a lot of money, and that's not what I want to be a part of my presidency. So Washington has a lot to think about. He has these ceremonial duties to consider. How many hands do I shake when I go to a evening meeting, or levee as they would call them? Hamilton's plan is working its way through Congress. Madison is drafting the Bill of Rights to be sent, once approved by Congress, to the different states. He's talking about Washington is doing a tour of New England to just be seen by folks. That's very dramatic when he does that. And then the next question that obviously comes up in a discussion when we're talking about so-called foreign policy. Why not Jefferson? And Jefferson is in the process of coming back from Paris. He was asked to be Secretary of State. He accepted with a couple of conditions. This is something to be said about Jefferson, that he, you tell Washington, a lot of people said, sure, yeah, I'll do it. I'm flattered, happy to help. And he's like, well, I got to get my stuff and affairs in order in Paris. My daughter's going to get married. That's going to be in Virginia. That's going to, put things off for a few months. And instead of Washington, who had well within his rights to say, oh, the hell with him, we'll get somebody else. He doesn't. He trusts the group around him and trusts that these folks will make good decisions. That's the most important part. All right, well, the other immediate factor, the practical aspect of all of this is that it's going to take Jefferson a long time to get up to speed and do the research that Knox had done. So Knox was there for basically years. Now, the cabinet's new, but under the Congress, before the creation of the Constitution, when the Congress was, again, the Congress from the Revolution in the 1780s, he effectively was serving in that capacity as kind of a de facto Secretary of War, the same way that John Jay was serving as kind of a de facto Secretary of State to the Congress. Didn't really have those titles, but you can understand why it was early on going to be the responsibility of Knox and Washington. The new treaties would take place under Knox's theme and make both sides equals. And this is Knox's words, quote, on principles consistent with the national justice and dignity of the United States, unquote. To say it differently, coercion would be replaced by consent. Both sides would pledge to follow the treaty. Troops would have to be used to enforce, and probably more for the settlers and maybe not necessarily for Native Americans. That was the complaint when Jackson was supportive of the Indian Removal Act. He basically thought Georgia was more responsible for the situation he had to deal with than the Cherokee living in Georgia. But he couldn't stop it, and this was the only solution. So troops would be needed basically to keep the settlers away from treaty land, and part of the treaty would be to give, the United States would kind of be held responsible for the livelihood of the Indians there. So tools and money and supplies, whatever was agreed upon in the treaty, would have to be dispersed and moved, and you would need the army, a much smaller army than you would need if you were going to fight with the Native Americans in the Southwest. It was also a hope that these tools and items would make Native Americans agricultural and not nomadic folks. Again, a lot of people thought that Native Americans were always on the move, on horseback, ignoring the fact that they had semi-permanent villages and that they farmed. And the farming didn't mean you had to run around half of the continent trying to shoot down animals or hunt deer or anything like that. So, Washington and Knox imagined what we would call homelands or enclaves that would exist east of the Mississippi River, protected by law, and the American settlers would simply go around them. Westward expansion would go hand in hand with the preservation of the original Americans, the Amerindians, as they're called, the indigenous people. And if they were moved forcibly, if they were conquered with violence into submission, that's not representative of the goals of the United States. So these are really, really high-minded ideals. The test case for Knox, and to show would this be possible and would we be successful, happened with the Creek Indians in the American Southwest. Let's go, since I've been talking quite a while without a visual, to a map. This is really the area that we're talking about. And what the map does is show you the actual finalized version of the Treaty of New York in 1790. The Creek Indians in the American Southwest reside in an area from western Georgia to northern Florida, across Alabama and in parts of Mississippi. The Creek are the southern, roughly, equivalent of the Iroquois Confederacy, meaning they were strong, they were politically organized, they could put a lot of fighters in the field, if that was an option. They had influence also of other tribes, like the Cherokee, like the Choctaw. And later, this will be one of the 5, as they will call them later on, civilized nations in the American Southwest. The dominant chief of the Creek, there he is Alexander McGillivray, who can speak for the nation and enforce the different agreements. So, the original plan is to meet with McGillivray and then to talk about how to best achieve this treaty. Washington then decides that he's going to put together this treaty, and he's going to have to meet with the Senate because they need to provide the advice and consent. So, Washington enters the Senate chamber with Knox, and this is just kind of a sign of respect. You were uncertain. Does advice and consent mean before or after? Uncertain. So as Washington and Knox approach the Senate, they say that this is what we have in mind. We're going to begin the process of negotiating a treaty. Several of the senators then ask, we can't do the whole advice and consent thing, Mr. President, without seeing the documents first. The documents related to the beginnings of these treaty negotiations. And this is when this kind of farcical episode happens. Washington starts, getting red-faced, steam coming from his ears. He's like, okay, sure, documents. Looks over at Knox, kind of gives him the high sign, like, we're out of here. And they leave. And he promises after this visit, this respectful visit to the Senate, I'm never coming back. Of course, he'd have to, and he had made that promise before when they were talking about, the titles for the presidency and some other issues that were up before that group. The Senate took itself very seriously. There are fewer, only 2 per state. Then they're in the House. The House is more raucous. The Senate's a little bit more refined. That's at least what the senators think of that. But Washington storming off and grumbling to Knox that you'll never see me here again. He did. But there isn't a debate. There isn't advice and consent until they actually agree that there's going to be a special commission put together to negotiate a treaty. So Washington's going to appoint some individuals to go there and talk with McGillivray. Interesting individual is McGillivray. His mother is half French and half Native American. His father, we think, is maybe Irish or Scottish. He's not very impressed with the early offer that the United States is hoping to put together a treaty. I think in McGillivray's mind, he doesn't have to agree to a treaty that surrenders or gives up anything. So in his mind, the Creek don't have to negotiate from a position of weakness, just the opposite, a position of strength. At the same time, the purpose of this treaty is to pull McGillivray and the Creeks into the circle of the United States, because McGillivray is getting supplies from the Spanish in Pensacola in Florida, which is not part of the United States. The Spanish may have helped in their own way to maybe weaken England by helping the United States in the Revolution, but they have no intention of surrendering the American Southwest or their hold on both the peninsula and the panhandle of Florida. Probably McGillivray also was cognizant of the fact that he could put out in the field 5,000 warriors if he had to, and scare the stuffing out of the state of Georgia, which was many more than the U.S. Army could handle. In 1790 and 1791, the United States Army, basically the Army, all of it, had their hands full fighting the Indians in the Northwest. And that wasn't going well at all. There were a couple of defeats, one a particularly humiliating defeat, only for Washington to be embarrassed by the entire situation. So it didn't go well. The representative sent by Washington to go to talk to McGillivray and company returned somewhat frustrated. The other factor working in 1790 was Georgia. In January of 1790, this is what makes the treaty at the federal level so important. The Georgia legislature, so the government within the state of Georgia, announces a sale of 24 million acres within the state. They sold it to 3 different investment companies known as the Yazoo companies. The Yazoo, thanks to Georgia and the legislature, who were, bribed and paid off for all of this. This was financial shenanigans at its finest. And that says a lot because there's a lot of financial shenanigans with land sales, railroads, corruption, and all kinds of other things within the United States. But the Yazoo company, the group multiple groups that bought this land and then would then sell it, bought cheap, sold expensively, and made a lot of money, claimed areas of Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi, all of which was in Creek country. It's also based on the shaky claim, this land sale, that the Western Territory of Georgia, where basically it ends, is the Mississippi River. That would be one heck of a state, Georgia all the way over, that would encompass, Mississippi and Alabama. That'd be pretty impressive. We know that the legislature owns stock in this land company, bought it ahead of time, and so their purchase got all the more valuable. McGillivray could defeat an American army. That's for sure. We'd have to put together a much larger force than he could put in the field. The one thing he could not do was fight off a sustained movement of settlers to the area. And I think maybe he realized that after thinking to himself at first, I'm negotiating from a position of strength. Well, I need to agree to some stipulations by the United States. So, to try to get him out of the way, and more importantly, the Creek Indians out of the way, the legislature of Georgia decided to try to bribe him. Pay the guy off, agree to move the land away further west, and the bribe didn't work because I think McGillivray knew, you might be wealthy, but then you'd be dead because that wasn't going to bode well for him. And I kid you not, folks, about the next part. The Georgia legislatures then put a price on McGillivray's head. They put a contract out for his assassination and would pay a reward if that took place. One of our shining moments in American history, or at least the history of Georgia, if there ever was one. So with that situation, Washington said, fine, I tried to send, out of respect, my own negotiators to Creek country. It didn't work. Washington and Knox then send an invitation to McGillivray and representatives of the Creek Nation to basically meet at a treaty summit. I think maybe that's the most effective thing to call it. The treaty summit, which ends up with the Treaty of New York in 1790. So they were come to the capital. They were welcomed like royalty, feted along the way. 700-mile trip from Creek country to the present capital of the United States. Members of Congress came out to cheer. It was quite festival, all of that. The Creek delegation stayed in the city of New York for almost a month. By that time, Thomas Jefferson arrived from overseas, conducted his business in Virginia, and then joined in on the deliberation. These deliberations from the federal level were very important. The treaty said that the Yazoo scheme was a fraud. And it was a fraud because when Georgia joined the Union, Georgia could not deal with any of their western lands. That power was given to the National Congress. Now, how that was going to hold up, anyone is up to anyone's guess, really. So you see the regulations in the treaty here. The first one signed between the United States and Native Americans. It was negotiated by Knox, and it was the first to be conducted after the end of the American Revolution. So the Creeks ceded or signed away part of their hunting grounds to the United States. They agreed to turn back runaway slaves to federal authorities. And the United States promised different elements of the treaty. They were going to deliver tools, livestock, as a way to provision and honor this agreement that the Creeks were going to be, in a manner of speaking, helped and aided by the United States government. So those were essentially the highlights of the treaty that passed in the Senate by a vote of 15-4. So in a treaty, you need 2/3, and that was an overwhelming majority. In August of 1790, that's when the treaty passed. Both Georgia senators voted no. Not a surprise there. James Jackson, remember that guy, right? The guy we love from the anti-slavery petitions, argued that Georgia just gave away 3 million acres. Not to Georgia and other people, but as he put it, quote, "Savages of the Creek Nation, caressed in a most extraordinary manner and sent home loaded with favors," unquote. What this treaty meant long term, and this is wooing or bringing in the Creek to the circle of the United States. The U.S. would, by providing these supplies, it would displace the Spanish as the major nation trading with the Creek. It signed over parts of Georgia, Alabama, and eastern Mississippi. The Creeks agreed not to move into white-controlled territory, and the American government gave the Creeks permission to punish white settlers to move west of the Oconee River. You can see that. That's the border right here. So that was the treaty lands in this green area. This was an improved upon treaty as others that had preceded it. The U.S. pledged to protect the Creek, no matter what size of their protectorate. So it's, again, that idea. They were going to protect the Creek from the settlers, who everyone knew was the real threat, and it turned out the states as well, when the legislature just says, hey, let's form this company, and who cares about the Indians who have claim to the land. They went one step further. I think that's pointed out in this slide. McGillivray was given an honorary rank of Brigadier General in the United States Army with the salary of $1,200 a year. And he would also be given supervision of a lot of the trade items that would be funneled through him when this treaty went into place. And it was going to. Except that the Georgia settlers completely undid the treaty before it ever had any chance of success. Literally, as you can say, as the expression goes, before the ink dried. They pour into the land by the thousands starting in 1790 after the Yazoo Company sale. Knox sent troops to the area to try to turn folks around, but he said it's like trying to stop a flood with a bucket of sponges. By the way, most of the soldiers were in the Northwest getting their behinds kicked by a substantial, organized, and well-led Confederation of Indians in the Northwest Territories. Washington threw up his hands and said, Georgia, they've undone it, the settlers of Georgia. He calls them a lawless set of unprincipled wretches. Later on, he would speculate, and he called it this in a writing, I think it was to Knox. You would need nothing short of a Chinese wall, he called it, like the Great Wall of China, to stop them from moving in violation of the treaty. McGillivray returned to the Spanish, revisited their headquarters, and said to them, look, I was just fooling and just playing the United States. You know, we had this whole meeting and they wined and dined all of us and it looked rather impressive. And the Spanish bribe him and he says, yeah, this was all kind of a hoax. I never meant to throw you over for the United States. And in 2 years, it's basically all undone, all of this work by Knox and company. McGillivray died in 1793. Those who succeed him as leaders of the Creek Indians reattach themselves with the Spanish. They prove a formidable ally with the Spanish, frustrating American efforts to move into the Southwest. And the area kind of reinvents itself, not after 1790, but especially after the War of 1812. Creek country becomes slave country. That's, in fact, the name of a book about the movement of slavery to the American Southwest in a treaty signed by, who else? Andrew Jackson, that removes the Creek not only west, but to smaller and smaller sections of Alabama in 1813, 1814, a treaty that's so substantial, it's almost an embarrassment for the administration that they have to agree with it. And they nearly cease to exist by the time of their forced removal, which will take place after 1830. Well, it's another one of those stories, right? It's another one of those stories where there was so much potential. It's a story of our infancy as a nation when there were many questions that didn't have answers. Who dealt with negotiating with Native Americans? What branch of the government? Could it be successful? Did it ever have a chance of success? Maybe not. And maybe they knew it from the beginning, but they tried anyway. What would have happened today if we had been in similar circumstances where we know where power is shared and we have more established history of this situation? And it's very simple to figure out. The president would have nationalized the Georgia Guard and said, stop the settlers from pouring into the Creek land. The Supreme Court would have said that the treaty was legal, ideally, because Georgia may have taken the United States to court over this, or the Creek Nation to court over this. But none of these were options. Washington maybe should have been given some credit for trying, but there was no idea that the Supreme Court would have to, scold Georgia. There were no soldiers to send. I mean, all he had to spare, I think Knox ended up with on their 200 soldiers that he could go down there and said, no, that's not even enough to slow anything down. And unfortunately, it is one of those episodes where there was great potential, great thought put into it, and maybe even a chance of success, but it didn't happen in the end. So I hope these are two more interesting stories that took place in 1790. We give a lot of focus to the Bill of Rights, the early Congress and what laws they were trying to pass, Hamilton's financial plan, foreign policy issues with Europe when they go to war with the wars of the French Revolution, as they were called in the 1790s, domestic policy, which include things like the Whiskey Rebellion. But I think these are two of the more interesting episodes in Washington's time and represent and tie back to this idea that the founding generation, which cast this long shadow, had a lot of success, but also had some pretty tremendous failures as well.